fragments here. And so he began to see if it would fit. And as he said, we have the fit, the Hebrew scholar says, oh, that's nonsense. Of course, here is confirmation of Christianity among the Jews. That's like trying to preach the resurrection to the Sanhedrin. And it's interesting to hear the way they respond. This is stupid. This is asinine. This is ridiculous. They don't say, well, yeah, it could be, but I don't think it is, which would be a rational way to respond to it. And they will say, well, you can make anything fit, and you have such small fragments. Well, that may sound reasonable, but that's not really reasonable. Here we're looking at that text of Mark chapter 6, with the text superimposed on it. Now, what is this? Well, let's just superimpose Mark 6, 52 through 53 over the top of it and move it around. And look, we get this third line here to fit. And look, we got the same words. It works, but the line below it doesn't work. And the line above it doesn't work. And that's not really a good fit. But how do we know the configuration here? Maybe the column was narrower. And with computers today, we can easily move the margins. And so when you move the margins in, whoa, it fits perfectly. And the word above it is what should be, the word below it is what should be, and it lines up. And when you get that much lined up, top and bottom and sideways, you have a fit. And it's just not reasonable to deny it otherwise. Mark 6, 52 through 53 fits perfectly. And as he continued then, finding Gennesaret and then the fit, he identified numerous New Testament passages, at least 18. Mark and Acts and Romans and 1 Timothy and 2 Peter and James. And this is before, necessarily, 68 A.D. Now, of course, the liberal theologians say this idea of the resurrection and the deity of Christ didn't develop till hundreds of years later as the myth grew. Now, here we have Mark describing, for example, in Mark chapter 13, what? The destruction of Jerusalem, which happened when? 70 A.D. And here we know it was written before 68 A.D. Wow. Just dynamite. The actual style of the letters helps date as well and implies a date of 50 to 55. But we know it had to be before 68 A.D. because the whole community was wiped out at that point by the Romans. Just dramatic, earth-shaking evidence that has recently developed. Also, we're finding more scrolls. You don't hear a whole lot about this, but these fragments were found in 2005 by Hanan Eshel, who was a very brave man, if not completely wise. He purchased fragments of the book of Leviticus in the summer of 2005 from some Bedouins, which was the only way to rescue them. They had found them. They had them. Well, how do you get? Well, you have to buy them. And so he put $3,000 of his own money into it. He immediately brought them to the Department of Antiquities saying, look what I've found. Well, you're not supposed to be finding stuff that's not in a providence dig. That's a favorite expression the elite archaeologists use. If it's not in a providence, that is authorized by the Department of Antiquities, we don't recognize it no matter what you find. His response was, wait a minute, none of the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in a providence dig. And here are more of them. Well, they didn't buy that. He was fired from his university position. He was imprisoned for 1 year, which shows the ferocity of the battle, trying to oppose any new evidence that will upset this Jewish hierarchy. Mr. Edschel worked with us in our dig there at Qumran. He is a friend of Dr. Price, and we're now working together. He has learned from the Bedouins where they obtained the fragments, and we have applied now for a permit. Now, once you find them in an official dig, then they're not going to put you in jail, and of course they're not going to want to do that, but Dr. Price has been successful in getting those permits, and we're working toward that. Here, Joseph is at one of the caves where we went that we hoped to be able to excavate, and he found a parchment fragment while we were there. You can see him holding it there as I took the picture. I've been asked to be a part of that, and that's an exciting prospect in the months and years to come. Now, before we conclude this evening, let's talk about the significance of the scrolls. We've talked about it by implication already. The scrolls reveal a sect whose approach to Scripture and whose view of prophecy were identical to the early church. Now, they had some different views. They had their son of righteousness, as they referred to him, who was to be the Messiah. But they referred back to Isaiah 53, and they described him just like the New Testament does. This destroys the liberal idea that beliefs described in the New Testament were a product of development over hundreds of years. We have it even before the time of Christ. And they can tell that tale all they want. It's not so. We didn't believe it to start with, and we have proof that it's not true at this point. Like John the Baptist, the Dead Sea sect believed that they were in the desert as forerunners of the Messiah, and that these prophecies, many of them, they applied to themselves as forerunners, and that the time had been fulfilled, unlike the premillennialist, it had been fulfilled. Now, Dr. Price is a premillennialist, and this gets to be interesting. He says, well, yes, it was the time that Isaiah pointed to, and that many of the other prophecies, they were right. But the Jews rejected, and so the prophecies were postponed. I think that's just another way for saying failed. I don't think that's a viable explanation. But they saw that as the approaching time of the Messiah. Like Jesus and the apostles, they believed they were living in the last days, that the Scriptures predicted a coming Messiah, and they described that Messiah as a suffering Messiah and as a resurrected Messiah. Oh, well, this is something the New Testament myth developed over hundreds of years. Now, this is before the time of Christ. They got this from Isaiah. I think that's very significant. As we look at the Dead Sea community, the Qumran community, we see obvious testimony to the accuracy of the transmission of the text. And this is one of the strongest lessons that we find from Qumran. Josephus made this interesting comment, perhaps referring to sects like the Qumran community and their scriptorium. He says, we have, and by the way, he's a first century Jewish historian, we have given practical proof of our reverence for our own Scriptures. For although such long ages have now passed, no one has ventured to add or to remove or to alter a syllable. And it is an instinct with every Jew from the day of his birth to regard them as the decrees of God, to abide by them, and to, if need be, cheerfully die for them. Now, this was the attitude that we see reflected in the Qumran community and that Josephus testifies to. When we see the instructions in numbers of these texts telling how to copy, we see obvious reverence for the text. For example, as they copied the text, they not only made sure they got each letter like the one they were copying from, but when they got through, they turned around and counted the letters and then kept a running total at the bottom of each page. What happens if they look over here and they count and come up one letter short? Well, they know they made a mistake. They throw that page away and they start over. By counting the letters across and down, they knew they were copying accurately. And this we find done for every book in the Old Testament. At least every book is represented. And this is over 1,000 years older than the oldest manuscripts that we had prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Apio Codex was the oldest Old Testament text. At the time of the translation of the King James, this is the Masoretic text, the text on which most of the modern translations are based.